The question asked at the end of the fourth stanza has been answered by the poet himself at the very beginning of the fifth stanza. And the sixth stanza is also a continuation of the same. And we have to keep in mind the idea of pre-existence and the philosophical doctrine of innatism here. So let us look at the beginning of the fifth stanza. Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. The soul that rises with us, our life's star, hath had elsewhere its setting, and cometh from afar, not in entire forgetfulness, and not in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory do we come, from God, who is our home. Heaven lies about us in our infancy. These expressions are very important and explains the core of this poem. Look at the very first line of the fifth stanza. Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. This implies that the memory of the heavenly life that the soul carries at birth would only get faded later. He uses the phrase elsewhere its setting. It actually means heaven was the original home of the soul, as we know from our knowledge of pre-existence and the philosophy of innatism. And now he says, not in entire forgetfulness and not in utter nakedness. Here the poet actually is referring to the divine knowledge which the soul is born with, implying that the mind does not remain blank or empty at birth, as is held by innatism. And this is a denial of empiricism. The great empiricist John Locke held that the mind of a newborn child is like a blank sheet of paper, a piece of clean slate. But Wordsworth, who actually uses the philosophy of innatism, contradicts it. He further illustrates, we come from God who is our home. Heaven lies about us in our infancy. This actually explains why the child is gifted with the prophetic vision. Because in its heavenly life, the soul lived in close contact with God. But towards the end of the stanza, we shall see the poet keeping his faith in nature, and devotion to nature is thus expressed. The youth who daily farther from the east must travel still is nature's priest. So the youth, though alienated from the bliss of his childhood, would remain devoted to the worship of nature. But he cannot forget the loss of divine memory. And look at the concluding line of the fifth stanza. At length the man perceives it die away, and fade into the light of common day. As far as the sixth stanza is concerned, there is nothing new. The same idea continues, and the important message of the stanza can be found as I have illustrated. Look on the screen. Forget the glories he hath known, and that imperial place whence he came. So this is again a reference to pre-existence. Now the seventh stanza. It starts with the poet's vision of a child, and the vision continues in the eighth stanza as well. The poet sees and describes how the blessed soul of this child would forget its original home, that is heaven, and lose its prophetic power as it would grow up. Now look at the annotations. Here the poet sees a 6-year-old child in a vision and addresses it. The stanza says that the process of growing up is like learning to imitate endlessly. Growing up also implies role playing, as you will find in this stanza, like an actor, as in a wedding or a funeral, a mourning, sorry, as in a wedding or a festival, a mourning or a funeral, on his humorous stage. The stanza goes on describing more role playing, and I quote, "Then will he feed his tongue to dialogues of business, love, or strife." So it describes how gradually, with the process of growing up, the child would get entrapped in the complexities of the adult world. Now the eighth stanza, which also thrives on the same idea. Here the poet addresses the boy as "thou best philosopher, then as mighty prophet, seer blessed." Here the poet talks about the child's heritage, which actually is the divine memory. The idea of pre-existence has been illustrated in phrases like "those truths," "thy immortality," etc. The poet actually wonders in this stanza why or how this blessed child would gradually get entangled in the worldly concerns, as reflected in the phrase "the inevitable yoke." The heavenly would be replaced with the earthly or the worldly as the child grows up in chains of forgetfulness. And I quote from the poem: "Full soon thy soul shall have her earthly freight, and custom lie upon thee with a weight, heavy as frost and deep almost as life."